Welcome everyone who's online for this PIM webinar. My name is Frank Place. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the CGIAR Research Program on Policies, Institutions, and Markets. This is our first webinar in the 2018 series, and today's topic is cash transfer programs and intimate partner violence, lessons from 3 case studies around the globe. This work is undertaken by PIM as part of our Social Protection for Agriculture and Resilience Research Flagship. I'm pleased to introduce our speakers today. The first is Melissa Hidrobo. She is a research fellow in the Poverty, Health, and Nutrition Division of the International Food Policy Research Institute. She is an applied microeconomist working at the intersection of gender, early childhood development, agriculture, and social protection. Her gender research focuses on how social protection programs affect intra-household dynamics and how intra-household dynamics affect agricultural production. She has investigated the impacts of cash transfers programs and food assistance programs through her work in Ecuador and Mali, and she's currently also working on impact evaluations of nutrition-sensitive agriculture and social protection programs in Ghana and Senegal. Melissa holds a PhD in agriculture and resource economics from the University of California at Berkeley. Her co-presenter today is Shalini Roy, who is a research fellow also in the Poverty, Health, and Nutrition Division of IFPRI. Her research focuses on households' economic behavior related to social protection, nutrition, agriculture, gender, and early childhood development. Much of her work is based on impact evaluations of development programming into these areas, with a particular interest in how programs both affect and are affected by intra-household dynamics. Her work spans South Asia with a regional focus in Bangladesh, Africa, and Latin America, and Shalini holds a PhD in economics from the University of Pennsylvania. Before I hand it over to Melissa and Shalini, I would like to explain how the webinar works, the logistics here. Our speakers will begin very shortly with the presentation that you will see on your screens. The presentation will last for about 30 minutes. During the presentation, we invite all of you to send in questions via the chat or question windows that you see on the right-hand side of your screens. We will collate the questions and group any that are similar in content and then pose them to the speakers. Once we are in the Q&A session, then they will address the speakers. Speakers will address the questions as we pose them to them. We may receive more than we can handle during the session, and so we will send those also to the presenters, and they can interact with you after the seminar is over. Now, we also are recording the webinar, and we'll make it available on the website, the PIM website, which is pim.cgir.org. And so that'll be available for you to look at it again, or for others who can't join us today. So with that, I will hand it over to Melissa, who will start the presentation.
Thank you, Frank, for that introduction. Good morning, everyone. I'm actually very excited to be doing the webinar today because it brings together quite a bit of work that IFPRI has been doing on cash transfers and intimate partner violence. And so we'll be discussing the 3 case studies that we have been working on. Sorry. Okay. So 1 in 3 women are victims of intimate partner violence in their lifetime. It is the most pervasive form of violence globally. And the economic costs of intimate partner violence range from 1 to 4% of GDP, which is likely an underestimate of the actual costs. The economic costs are both on women through sort of the deterioration of her physical and mental health. And there's also intergenerational costs, as children have poorer child development, nutrition, and health. And they are also more likely to enter into abusive relationships. Recent literature shows that cash transfer programs in developing countries can reduce intimate partner violence. And what the literature finds are decreases in physical violence by 5 to 11 percentage points, although some subgroups are found at risk for increases in violence. And though some groups are found at risk for increases in violence, on average, the literature has shown that there's usually a decrease in physical violence as a result of cash transfer programs. Now, this is quite promising given that there are approximately 1 billion cash transfer beneficiaries in over 130 countries, so it could be a promising platform through which to reduce intimate partner violence. Now, cash transfer programs are primarily a policy tool to respond to poverty and vulnerability, but there may be that variations in the design features will have implications for their effects on intimate partner violence. And so while the previous literature that I mentioned on cash transfers and intimate partner violence, they often focus on programs that are targeted to women in Latin America, often with complementary features. And so one question that arises is, how far can we generalize these findings? And so what we do is we examine 3 case studies from around the globe in Ecuador, Bangladesh, and Mali, and we address 3 distinct policy design questions about how transfer programs can reduce intimate partner violence. All 3 studies are similar in that they draw on cluster randomized controlled trials, which is sort of the gold standard for impact evaluation. And all 3 studies use mixed methods to understand what happens and why. So the 3 case studies, the first one is in Ecuador, and the policy question that we are trying to address is whether or not the modality of the transfer provided, cash, food, or vouchers, matters for impacts on intimate partner violence. And this is an important policy question because modalities other than cash are widespread around the world and may be actually implemented because they might have other objectives. And so one question is, are there trade-offs? Do impacts on intimate partner violence differ if you actually implement a different modality other than cash? The second country is Bangladesh. And the question we try to address is, what happens to IPV after a transfer program ends? And does it depend on complementary activities provided along with transfers? And again, complementary features are common in a lot of cash transfer programs, but they may be challenging to implement. And so the question that arises is, are they needed for intimate partner violence impacts? And many CT programs, again, do not continue indefinitely. And so the policy question is then, is this a sustainable approach to reducing intimate partner violence? Or once cash transfer programs end, do households revert back to how they were before? Lastly, in Mali, we ask the question, what are the impacts on intimate partner violence when cash transfers are targeted primarily to men, and does it depend on household structure? And so in some regions, targeting women may be viewed as contextually inappropriate. And so the question that arises is, can targeting men affect impacts on intimate partner violence? And if so, how? Diverse household structures are also common. And specifically in Mali, polygamy is quite common. And so the question that then arises are impacts on intimate partner violence generalizable to different household structures, and specifically in Mali, to polygamous households as well as monogamous households. So before we introduce the 3 case studies and go into the specifics of the 3 case studies, we're going to talk a little bit about the conceptual framework as to why cash transfer programs may lead to either increases or decreases in intimate partner violence. This conceptual framework was developed by Anna Buehler and co-authors, and it's a mixed method review of cash transfers and intimate partner violence in low and middle income countries. And so in the far left box, you start out with sort of the program design characteristics of cash transfer programs. And these program design characteristics of cash transfer programs are the size and frequency and duration of transfers, the targeting criteria for households of picking household beneficiaries, the recipient of the transfer, if the recipient is male or female, the messaging and objectives and the framing of the transfer program, whether programs are conditional on different activities such as attending schools or attending health centers, and whether programs are linked with other sort of complementary programs. And so all these different design characteristics are going to influence sort of these proximate outcomes, which are household level access to cash, a woman's access to cash, knowledge, skills, and access to service generated, mainly through sort of either conditionalities or these complementary programs, and then also social capital and networks, again, that are sort of mainly coming through the system linkages and complementary activities. And so these different design characteristics are going to influence these proximate outcomes and also more distant outcomes such as intimate partner violence. And the way they will influence the more distant outcomes of, and intimate partner violence is we talk about 3 different pathways. The first pathway that we talk about or develop was sort of pathway 1, which we call economic security and emotional well-being pathway. And this pathway has to do with the fact that at their core, cash transfer programs are social safety net programs that are intended to reduce poverty and increase a household's economic security. And many cash transfer programs, or many studies do show that cash transfer programs have in fact increased households' food security, saving assets and investments, and also improved their coping strategies. Improved economic security then is linked and associated with improved emotional well-being and improved mental health. And this sort of linkage of poverty and poor emotional state, or economic security and improved emotional state, is mainly through, so if we think of poverty as a risk factor for poor mental health and stress, it's mainly through malnutrition, social exclusion, sleep deprivation, physical pain, and exposure to trauma and violence. And so these are sort of reasons or factors for why poverty may lead to poor emotional well-being. Now, poor emotional well-being, in turn, is associated with increased intimate partner violence. So poor emotional well-being is associated with increased intimate partner violence, or improved emotional well-being within decreased intimate partner violence. And the risk, and the reason for this sort of poor emotional state being a risk factor for intimate partner violence is through its influence on decision-making and cognitive function. And so an individual who's in a poor emotional state is more likely to have worse decision-making and cognitive function, more likely to have short-sightedness, risk-averse, be more risk-averse, and decreased memory. And so these will lead to increases in intimate partner violence. Indirectly as well, poor emotional well-being and poor emotional state is also linked to increased substance abuse and alcohol abuse. And increased alcohol abuse is then sort of also related to intimate partner violence. Increased substance abuse is a risk factor for intimate partner violence. And again, alcohol affects intimate partner violence in multiple ways. It triggers arguments. It affects problem solving and other cognitive abilities. It lowers inhibition and makes it easier to misinterpret verbal and nonverbal cues. And so increased alcohol abuse would lead to increased intimate partner violence, or in our case, and decreased use of alcohol abuse because of improved emotional well-being would decrease intimate partner violence. The second pathway focuses much more on intra-household conflict, so conflict within the household, among members of the household. And so this pathway, it has more to do with sort of the availability of cash into the household and the conflict that may or may not arise due to sort of more cash and more resources in the household. And so the top box focuses on increased availability of cash to meet daily needs. And so this would actually decrease conflict in the household and in the relationship. This, for example, now that a household has more resources, more money, there's less fighting over sort of the scarce resources, how to use it. If a woman needs money to buy food, sort of there's less conflict because now her husband actually or the household actually has the money available. The bottom box sort of is the opposite in the sense that increased availability of cash may actually lead to purchase of temptation goods. Temptation goods here means sort of alcohol, tobacco, and also used on other women. And an increased availability of cash for purchases of temptation goods may actually would lead to an increased conflicts in the relationship. And so this increased conflict in the relationship would increase intimate partner violence, the arrow pointing down, whereas before the increased availability of cash to meet daily needs would decrease conflict and decrease intimate partner violence. Just to say that this second, so the bottom box where you see the increased availability of cash for purchase of temptation goods, the literature does not actually support that this occurs through cash transfer. So there's very little evidence in the literature showing that cash transfer leads to purchases of temptation goods. However, it is possible, so we still include it in the framework. Lastly is the third pathway, which is women's empowerment. And so cash transfers are often hypothesized to empower women either through increasing their direct access to cash, information, mainly through trainings, or social network via group activities. And studies have shown that cash transfers have increased a woman's self-confidence, self-efficacy, her financial autonomy, and may also increase her productive investments and activities. Now, improvements in a woman's empowerment, improvements sort of in her access to cash, information, and social networks, is going to lead to sort of improvements in her bargaining power because she now has, it's going to shift the relationship and the power dynamics within the relationship because she now has an increased ability to leave the relationship. So her threat of leaving the relationship is more credible because she now has access to resources, to information, and social networks. And as a result, she is going to have sort of an improved bargaining power. She's going to have more ability to assert her preferences within the household. Now, how her partner reacts to this improved position could go either way. So her partner may react and be accepting and appreciate her improved status and improved knowledge. And in which case, it would mean that he decreases intimate partner violence. The intimate partner violence decreases. On the other hand, her partner may feel threatened and react negatively to her improved position within the household. And so he may be more concerned that a woman is sort of threatening his authority. So instead it could lead to sort of this male backlash where he increases violence and intimate partner violence increases. So those are the three pathways, and these three pathways, whichever pathway sort of is more relevant, is going to really depend on program design characteristics and also the context, which is down below, the different context. So moving to the first case study. In the first case study is Ecuador, where, again, the question that we are asking is, does the modality of transfers provided, food, cash, or voucher, matter for impacts on intimate partner violence? The program that we evaluated is the Cash, Food, or Voucher program, which was implemented by the World Food Program from April 2011 to September 2011. And the design features of this specific program was first the targeting. It was targeted to poor households and Colombian refugees. The recipients were women within the household, the recipients of the transfers. The size and the frequency is they were 6 monthly transfers of $40. And the transfer programs were combined with complementary activities, which were monthly nutrition trainings. The objective of the program was, first of all, to improve a household's food consumption and food security. Second, to reduce tensions between Colombian refugees and Ecuadorians. Third, to improve a woman's role in decision-making over food consumption. So as you can see, the objective was not specific to intimate partner violence, although dimensions of women's role in decision-making were involved. The study design for the impact evaluation was, we did an impact evaluation in 2 urban centers in northern provinces of Ecuador, where we randomly assigned clusters to either receive cash, food, vouchers, or no transfer. And then we collected quantitative and qualitative data. The quantitative data was longitudinal, so we followed the same households at baseline before the transfer started, and then at end line right after the last transfer. And so this was 6 months because the program was the program lasted 6 months, the duration of the program. In our quantitative surveys, in both the baseline and the end line, we collected WHO Violence Against Women instrument. We implemented the WHO Violence Against Women instrument in both rounds. In the qualitative data collection, it was composed of in-depth interviews and investigation of pathways through which the cash transfers influence intimate partner violence. The qualitative data collection was actually in September of 2013, which was 2 years after the last transfer program. So it was after the program had ended. For results, the graph here shows sort of the result on physical violence. So these are adjusted means of any physical violence in the last 6 months at end line. And you can see for the control group, 20% of women in the control group had experienced any physical violence in the last 6 months. In the food, cash, and voucher, the range of the percentage of women experience any physical violence in the last 6 months ranges from 13 to 15%. And this difference, with respect to food, cash, and vouchers, the difference is significantly different compared to the control group. And so we do see anywhere between a 25 to 35% decrease in physical violence as a result of the different transfer modalities. Now, another thing is that the impacts do not significantly differ by transfer modalities. So impacts, modality does not affect the impact on intimate partner violence modality. Looking at pathways, and our pathways are mainly coming through the qualitative work. So these are all quotes that came out of the qualitative work. And so the first pathway was, we do see improvements in a woman's empowerment. 2 specific quotes with respect to this is, the first is, when I got the transfer, it was both of us who were head of the household, because with that I got the transfer, I could buy food and all, and he could pay for other things. And so the transfer is leading to sort of both of individuals within the household being household heads. The second quote is, I always spend my time at home. I do not go out much. I do not know how to relate with people very well. And there in the training, you slowly lose the shyness. I used to be very shy. Now I'm only a bit shy. And so again, the second quote emphasizes sort of improvements in a domain of her sort of self-confidence. However, it's more related to the complementary activity of trainings more than the cash transfer in and of itself. The second pathway is improvements in households' economic well-being. And in the quantitative work, we do see improvements in food security and food consumption. And in the qualitative work, we see a quote that says the following: in my household, it was like happiness. We all got along with my children, with my husband. In my household, we were happy because before we did not have enough money for these things. So this second quote is focused more on the first pathway, where improvements in a household's economic well-being is really causing improved emotional state. It's leading them to be happier. The third pathway is decreases in intra-household conflict. And with the following quote: "Sometimes problems arise because I'm in need of money for one or other thing, and there's no money, and that is when problems start, the fights. And the transfers, helped us a lot. My partner, had money to buy other things for the house or pay debts." So this is showing sort of that cash in the household is actually leading to less conflict, less disputes within the household. Now, one thing to note is that because, as I mentioned in the earlier slide, in the previous slide, that the qualitative data collection was 2 years after the program ended, we do see suggestive evidence that once the program ended, the dynamics and the impacts reverted back to the way things were before the transfers. And with that, I will pass it on to my colleague Shalini to discuss the other case studies.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Frank, for the introduction, and thank you all for joining. So Melissa's last point about Ecuador is the perfect segue into the Bangladesh case study, where we thought now there's considerable evidence on the impacts of IPV during a program. Let's look more closely at what happens after the program ends. And specifically, does that effect depend on what complementary activities were provided alongside the transfers? So in Bangladesh, we looked at the program, the Transfer Modality Research Initiative, or TMRI, which was implemented by the World Food Program in Bangladesh. It was a pilot program for 2 years, from May 2012 to April 2014. It was targeted at very poor rural households with a child that was under 24 months at the start of the program. And the recipient of the program was the mother of that child. So this was targeted at women as well. The transfers that they received were each worth 1,500 taka, which is about $18, and they received them every month for 2 years. The key part of this case study that we focus on in this presentation is that those receiving transfers were also randomized to either receive or not receive a complementary activity, which was an intensive nutrition behavior change communication, or BCC. And this involved several components, the core part of which was weekly group meetings between the beneficiary mothers in a village and a trained nutrition worker. So that's a picture of that on the right. A second component was twice a month home visits from that nutrition worker to kind of see if the messages that were being conveyed were being taken up at the household, and also monthly community meetings where the trained nutrition worker talked with community leaders to convey what they were doing in these trainings with mothers. So this was really quite intensive. The messages were all focused on infant and young child feeding, but it was actually quite transformative in the communities because it was really bringing these women out into kind of their communities. The primary objectives of the program were, like with Ecuador, to improve household food security, and in this case also to improve child nutrition. There was no explicit gender objective, but the design was quite gender sensitive, and that shows up primarily in the BCC, where in Bangladesh the context is such that female seclusion norms are still predominant, meaning that women have very limited mobility outside their homes usually without male company. And so for them to come to these trainings was kind of already a transgression of norms, but the program basically invited husbands and mothers-in-law to come along to some of these weekly group meetings. This kind of served two roles. One, so that they could kind of see what was going on, okay it, and then allow the wives to come. And the second is that women's decision-making is still quite limited even within the household. So in terms of both food purchases, which men usually make, and kind of decision making on feeding and meal planning, which mother-in-laws usually make, you really need them to be on board. So for them to come to some of the trainings really got them on board with the BCC, and it was actually a very successful component, which was quite well attended. So to very quickly give you an overview of the design here, this was done by IFPRI and our Bangladesh collaborators' data. We studied rural villages, 500 rural villages in the northwest and southern coast of Bangladesh. These were all rural, and we randomly assigned these villages to either receive cash or equal value food, and that part we won't get into in this presentation. The key part that we'll focus on here is that of those, we randomized as well whether the transfers were received with or without the BCC that I mentioned. And in terms of data that we drew on, this was kind of a full-scale impact evaluation looking at impacts on all sorts of things, focused particularly on food security and child nutrition. So we had longitudinal data from baseline, midline, endline, but specifically for this question on intimate partner violence, we added a post-endline survey round 6 to 10 months after the intervention ended. And here we asked the same WHO violence against women instrument that Melissa mentioned in Ecuador. We did not, unlike Ecuador, have a qualitative component that was specifically focused on gender, but we did do a process evaluation during the intervention that gives us quite a bit of qualitative insight that we're able to use for this analysis. So jumping to our results, I'll first kind of tell you the headline findings and then point out where it shows up in the graph. So kind of the key finding is that 6 to 10 months after the program ended, the women that had been receiving transfers plus BCC during the program experienced a 26% reduction in physical violence in the past 6 months relative to those who were in the control group. So this is even after the program ended, we see a significant impact, a significant reduction in those who had received transfers plus BCC. So in the control group, you see about 27% of women reported IPV and the physical IPV in the last 6 months, where in the transfer plus BCC, it's 20%. So it goes from a little over one in 4 to 1 in 5. Meanwhile, there's no significant impact at all on physical violence from those who receive transfers only 6 to 10 months post-program. So you can see that both the control and the transfer only arm show 27%. And this really indicates that the transfers, if they had any impact, it's kind of completely gone by 6 to 10 months post-program. So here I'll note that we do have suggestive evidence. We can't show this as rigorously as the post-program impact, but we do have suggestive evidence that during the intervention, while the transfers were ongoing, both the transfers only and the transfers plus BCC were reducing IPV, so that there were effects during the program. But essentially, as soon as the program ended, as Melissa described in Ecuador, the transfer only arm reverted to how it was, whereas the transfer plus BCC was able to sustain these impacts. And again, I won't get into this, but we didn't find any differences between the food and cash here either. So then the question arises, well, what is going on that the transfers plus BCC are able to sustain impacts on IPV relative to the transfers? So we aren't able to isolate this exactly, but we have suggestive evidence for 3 possible pathways, 2 of which overlap with what Melissa described in the conceptual framework and for Ecuador. So the first is an improvement in women's threat point or empowerment. And here we look at 3 dimensions. So in terms of making her threat to leave the relationship or kind of live independently more credible, we think of the economic dimension, her having economic resources, her sort of psychological resources or agency, and her social resources or social capital. Where could she go and who would she count on if she left her relationship? So in terms of economic resources, unfortunately, I can't get into how we think the BCC did all these things, but we find that even at post-endline, women who receive the BCC report that they have more control over money, they participate more in work. And remember, even those who were receiving transfers only, the transfer was targeted to them. So the BCC somehow increases their control over money. In terms of agency, we see sustained increases in women reporting greater locus of control, which is sort of ability to control your life, greater self-confidence. We think that comes from the trainings. And we see an increase in social capital. So kind of by construction, just by bringing women into these groups that are meeting so regularly, that happens. We also have evidence both quantitatively and quantitatively that the BCCs were leading to neighbors in the community coming over to the woman's place to want to learn about what they'd learned in this session. And because these were very poor women who were often kind of stigmatized and treated as beggars before, we have a quote in the process evaluation saying the BCC training really boosted the family status and specifically of the women themselves. The second pathway we see is actually a little different than what comes out in the framework, and this is the idea that partly kind of related to this idea of women's social capital increasing, we think there might have been an increased cost for men of inflicting violence. So this is the idea that's in the criminology literature that physical violence or women kind of being more visible and having more social resources actually increases the detection of physical violence and kind of social scorn and disdain for it. So we don't have direct evidence of this in our data, although we certainly have increased social capital. But there is a review by Brody et al. On self-help groups, and they find in South Asia a very common finding that self-help groups put social pressure on men to stop beating their wives and actually show up in groups to support women who had been beaten. And they find this in something like 8 or 9 case studies in South Asia, so it seems very plausible that some of this is going on here too. And the final pathway relates to what Melissa described in Ecuador as well. Interestingly, we see that the transfers plus BCC actually more than the transfers increase household wealth at end line. And given that some of this seems to be coming from increases in assets and income generation, we think this is likely to be sustained after the program. And so this has kind of the related effects on reducing stress and conflict. We have a quote in the process evaluation that kind of echoes one of the quotes Melissa mentioned for Ecuador, where a woman says if she had asked her husband to buy some food when there was none in the house previously, he would become angry and hit her. Now, she says, he's generally quite pleasant and doesn't fight with her anymore. So really what these pathways suggest is that the BCC led to the sustained effect on pathways, although we can't exactly isolate which, whereas the transfers kind of were not able to, whatever pathway it was coming through, it was not able to sustain the effect. With that, I'll move to the third case study in Mali, where the main question is, okay, so we've looked at quite a few studies where transfers are targeted to men. Let's look at one where the transfers are targeted primarily to men, and also acknowledge that household structures are quite diverse in a lot of developing countries, and look at how does the effect on IPV depend on that. So here we look at the Mali government's national cash transfer program, which the Bambara name for is Jigisemejiri. It started in 2014 and it's still ongoing. This is targeted to poor rural households, but unlike the other programs that we talked about, this is targeted to heads of household. And this really contextually they felt was the only way you could do it. They didn't feel you could kind of give money to anyone but the kind of patriarch in the family. And so these heads of household are almost always men. The size and frequency approximately, it's 30,000 sefa, which is approximately $18 a month, once every 3 months. These were also accompanied, so there's 2 components, the second of which, preventive nutrition packets, was not yet implemented when we did the study, so that's not part of the study. The first part, bi-monthly trainings focused on nutrition, health, finances, and use of cash, were always were kind of available to everyone who was receiving the transfers. Our kind of process evaluation, which is not yet complete, but we've so far have indication that it was not quite as intensive as Bangladesh and also not quite as well attended, particularly by women. The program in Mali was really focused on household food security and child nutrition, and kind of ostensibly there's no gender-related objective to it. So again, a quick overview of the study design. 5 southern regions, Sikaso, Kolikoro, Kaem, Mopti, and Seku. And it's worth noting that of these, in our sample, 36% of households are polygamous, so more than 1 in 3. It's quite a large share. We randomly assigned communes, or the program randomly assigned communes to either receive kind of a combined treatment, which is transfers with training, or the control, meaning no transfers or training. Again, this was part of a large impact evaluation with longitudinal data, but the one that we focus on here is a midline round that was after 1 to 2 years of intervention. And there, because this is a program that was targeted at men, we really tried to get at detailed modules on pathways related to men, so looking at men's well-being, how they interact with the transfer, as well as administering the WHO Violence Against Women instrument. The qualitative work is still, the analysis is still underway. Just to note that we do have in-depth interviews with men and women in both polygamous and monogamous households, but that is sort of, right now it's TBD what exactly comes out of it. So again, our headline result first, and then I'll mention it in the graph. So the headline result is that if you separate out our sample by polygamous households and monogamous households, in the polygamous households, you see at midline, 1 to 2 years after intervention, a 41% decrease in physical violence. In monogamous households, you see no impact. So it's worth noting that in the control group in monogamous households, the rate of IPV reported is lower than the rate of IPV reported in controlled polygamous households. So in controlled polygamous households, it's 18% and it goes down to 11%. In monogamous households, it's 12% in the control and basically the same, 13% in treatment. But what this suggests is that there are very big impacts on IPV, physical IPV, but only in polygamous households. So the natural question is, how and why is that happening? So thinking about the pathways, this seems to come from two of the pathways that Melissa described. First, in polygamous households, much more so than monogamous households, we see improved men's emotional well-being, which, as Melissa described, is a trigger or kind of a trigger for decreased IPV. So we see significantly reduced men's stress and anxiety, more so in polygamous households than monogamous households. We also see significantly decreased reports of intra-household conflict, more so in polygamous households than monogamous households. So there's self-reported disputes between spouses, there's a significant decrease in that. Meanwhile, we don't see any evidence of significant changes in women's empowerment in either polygamous or monogamous households, which you might expect because there's really nothing in this program that, between the transfers or the trainings, that were really reaching women. But this kind of brings up the question of, okay, so we have some idea of the pathways differing for polygamous versus monogamous, but we don't really know why they do, and that's something that we're still currently exploring. So there's kind of three possibilities that we're looking at. One is the idea that conflict was higher in polygamous households, even in the control group. So even in the absence of the program, conflict and stress are higher in polygamous households. So maybe there's just more potential for impact. Two other possibilities are maybe there's observable other things associated with polygamy, whether it's kind of the norms of men, whether it's the demographics of the household that explain some of the differences. Another possibility is maybe there's just something inherent to the inter-household dynamics of polygamous households which changes the way they interact with the transfer. So maybe there's something about the communication or cooperation between partners. And that's something that we're still exploring, and we hope the qual helps us shed some light on. So to wrap up, there's a few takeaways that we want to flag for the design of cash transfers to reduce IPV. The first is that we actually find quite a few commonalities in the findings, despite there being diverse program features and diverse contexts. So these programs are coming from Latin America, South Asia, West Africa. We have pilot programs, we have national government programs. The period they span goes from 6 months to 2 years plus. We have targeting men, we have targeting women, we have differences in modalities. So all that notwithstanding, we find that cash transfers reduce IPV in all three case studies, and that's even though it's not the main program objective in any of them. We also want to note that although there is potential for transfers to increase IPV, as Melissa described in the conceptual framework, we actually don't find evidence of this occurring in any of the three case studies. So then the question is, okay, well then do all these variations in program features and context matter? So there we think in some cases yes, and in some cases we don't see evidence of that. So for cash versus food versus vouchers, we do not see that it necessarily changes impacts on IPV. In Ecuador, we saw no difference at all between the modalities, and in Bangladesh, where we compared cash versus food, we also saw no difference. We do see that complementary activities may be critical for sustaining impacts on IPV. In Bangladesh, we basically saw that everything went back to the way it was without the BCC, whereas the BCC sustained the impacts. And we find that transfers targeted to men can reduce IPV, so it's not absolutely critical. It's not absolutely a requirement that it be transferred to women. But that said, it may depend on the context. So in Mali, we see that transfers targeted to men reduce IPV only in the polygamous households, and we're still trying to work out exactly what that means. So 2 last points. First, we think that when designing CT programs, if you are trying to affect IPV, it's really important to think about how features and context will affect the pathways. So thinking about Bangladesh, we really seem to get the sense that impacts on IPV will revert if the program doesn't sustainably affect the pathways. And that's what we think the BCC in Bangladesh was able to do. Secondly, it's worth thinking about whether the pathways that you're targeting might actually depend on household structure or other contextual factors. For example, in Mali, the way the polygamy really seemed to change whether the transfers affected men's emotional well-being and disputes, which in turn affect IPV. All that said, we think that our case studies combined with the previous evidence suggest transfer programs are really quite promising as a scalable, globally relevant approach to reducing IPV. But we still want to note that more rigorous evidence is really needed to explore generalizability. We've kind of looked at some questions, but there's a lot we don't know still. In that effort, we want to note that for us, what's been quite useful is we've found that really valuable evidence can be generated by measuring IPV in evaluations, even if it's not the primary program objective. And just to note that if you have a randomized study, even if you didn't collect IPV at baseline, you can still collect it in a follow-up to look at impacts on IPV. And we also want to flag that we think it's really important to incorporate qualitative work to understand pathways, since as we've noted, pathways really give you a lot of implications for how you need to design the program and what really matters. So just before we close, we want to gratefully acknowledge funding from PIM, from IFPRI, the World Bank, 3IE, the Government of Mali, Government of Spain by the World Food Program, and an anonymous donor. This last slide has references for the case studies as well as the conceptual framework. And we'll end there. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks very much, Melissa and Shalini. We received a few questions, and I have a couple on my my own behalf if we don't receive more. But let me start with one that applies to all the case studies you presented. So you presented some results on intimate partner violence, and there was a question of whether you looked more generally at how these interventions, social protection with different modalities, affected gender dynamics more broadly than just IPV. That was one question. So you can go ahead and answer that.
Do you want to go first? Sure. So we did look at other gender dynamics apart from intimate partner violence, but mainly with respect to looking at sort of pathways and what changed in general within the household on sort of the dynamics in the relationship, and then with sort of always in mind the final outcome of intimate partner violence. And so it differs by country. In Ecuador, we looked at decision making. I think in all 3 countries we've looked at decision making. Where we have the most sort of evidence, or where we have the most data collected on sort of the relationship dynamics in other gender domains, is probably going to be in Mali and Bangladesh. Where in Mali we really asked both the sort of head of household and their spouse questions on disputes, on conflict, on decision making. We had put in part of the WEA modules, so decision making with respect to productive assets, or respect to production, assets as well. And so we do, and we have looked at it, but mainly sort of as a pathway through which we see impacts on intimate partner violence. I don't know if you want to add anything, Shalini.
Nothing major. I would just add that, as Melissa said, we were kind of always thinking of trying to frame what we were looking at along the conceptual framework. That said, in Bangladesh, we did look at some other dimensions of kind of women's well-being. We see, reductions in women's depression. We see, like, even in the field, when we would visit women who received the BCC, we noticed that they were just so much more confident and outspoken. So there's other things that we could look at with respect to gender dynamics. And I think specifically in Bangladesh, we do have some evidence that women's well-being just overall seem to be improved with the BCC. But yeah, in terms of these studies, we were really kind of trying to focus on tracing it out through the framework. The other thing to note is that we're doing a follow-up study in Bangladesh to look at kind of 4 years after the intervention ended. That's going to be in the field in a few days, actually. So that we're actually looking much more at gender dynamics more broadly. So kind of looking at men's and women's well-being generally, and also how they interact well after the program's ended.
Great. And then there was just a related question that whether you looked at also intra-household decision-making and other gender roles and dynamics as an influencer on how things would turn out in the end. So, as a factor in how the results would shape out. Yeah. I don't know.
I mean, we can quickly. So that was part of what we looked at in terms of women's empowerment. Right. So in Mali, we did not find any effects on that at all. We did look at decision making. Mm-hmm. In Bangladesh, we found it in some dimensions. Mm-hmm. In Ecuador.
In Ecuador, we found it come out much more in the qual than in the quant, but we did look at it both in the qual and in the quant impacts on decision making.
Okay. And a question that now we have a question about your results and findings and implications. So you mentioned that the BCC addition to the social protection program in Bangladesh seemed to be quite effective in sustaining the effects. So the question was, do you think there's enough evidence to recommend that a BCC arm be included in cash transfer programs explicitly to help improve household relations? And then maybe a secondary question on that is, can it be BCC on any kind of training, or is there evidence from other types besides nutritional training?
Yep. Yeah. So that's a great question. We've actually, so as we were kind of working through these results, we were trying to work out if we could isolate what is it about the BCC that's causing these impacts. And as we mentioned, there's enough. So there's a lot of components in the BCC. There's the weekly meetings, there's the home visits, there's the community meetings. It's hard to know which component of that was contributing to things. It's also hard to know which of the pathways was actually the strongest. So, and one data point is better than zero, but it's still one data point in one very specific context. So my view would be that it's certainly something that's worth testing more. Whether we have kind of conclusive evidence that this is the way to kind of lead to improvements in household relations, I don't know if we could confidently say yet. And in terms of like what the content needs to be, again, we just don't know. Like, it did not focus on gender relations. So it does suggest that the content may not have been quite as critical as the fact that it was bringing women together and bringing them out into the community. That said, one note is that it was kind of a non-threatening subject. So if women were being brought out to talk about, spousal relations with their husbands, have been more opposed to them participating? Maybe. So it's a bit hard to know exactly how we can generalize that. That said, we also have a few other studies right now. I think you guys in Ethiopia are doing something like this too. In Bangladesh, we have another study called the ANGEL study, the Agriculture, Nutrition, Gender Linkages study, where we're kind of looking at IPV impacts from an agricultural extension intervention that reaches men and women, that same extension with a nutrition BCC, that same extension with nutrition BCC and a gender intervention compared against people who are receiving only BCC. So that might help us to shed a little bit more light on what, if any, of these components seems to really make a difference for household relations and whether the content matters. Do you have something to add, Melissa?
Yeah, the one thing I just have to add is in Bangladesh, yes, we do see that the BCC was necessary for sustaining impacts on intimate partner violence. What Shalini was mentioning, what I think it's good to point out is what we don't know is how intense the BCC really needs to be. In Bangladesh, the BCC component was very, very intense. And so what we don't know is, will a lesser intense BCC program also sort of lead to sustainable impacts in intimate partner violence. And so it's just worth noting how intense the BCC really was in Bangladesh.
Yeah, you've touched upon this, another question we received in your answer just to the previous question, but just more generally was, if you were to design a program that was actually trying to reduce IPV, what can we learn from your studies or the literature about what types of add-ons or other program design components that should be used?
Sure. I think it's important when designing the program to think through the different pathways and how different program features may affect the different pathways. And so in Mali, we do see that targeting men can also lead to decreases in intimate partner violence for some households. But if you really want sort of the empowerment pathway to be a main sort of pathway, you likely need to do something that's a little more targeting women. And so that would be one thing to think through if it's feasible in the context or not. Some contexts like Mali wasn't very feasible. Another program component are sort of the additional trainings. And I think there is quite a bit now of literature and other evidence showing that sort of social groups and these sort of training and bringing women together are also sort of leading to improvements in a woman's empowerment in different domains. It doesn't necessarily have to, as the Bangladesh study shows, it doesn't specifically have to be about relationship dynamics, gender dynamics, but just the fact of bringing women together, providing them with information that they may not have, allowing them to leave their household does have sort of these empowerment effects in and of itself. And so again, if you really want to focus on that pathway, those would be sort of program components to think about.
And just to add to that, I think we see some evidence from these studies that improving household welfare can be a pretty important part of reducing IPV, just reducing the stress. So, would the BCC alone have been enough? Maybe not, because it does seem like kind of reducing the poverty-related stress is a pretty crucial part of a lot of these programs. So that seems like it might be necessary to see these results. That said, like Melissa, I think empowering women in some way, whether it's actually through transferring directly to her, or maybe more importantly, just making sure that she is somehow socially empowered, seems really important. And if you want the effects to be sustainable, I think, as we noted, kind of thinking through what pathways will be sustainably affected by your intervention is really important.
Just a related question on these program add-ons and so forth is, was there any analysis about the cost of these different, say the BCCs and the cost effectiveness in general, not just with IPV, because I think they're intended for other objectives as well, but has there been some studies to incorporate that?
So my short answer is we definitely looked at it for Bangladesh, and unfortunately I don't have that number written down. I will say it's fairly expensive. The Bangladesh BCC was fairly expensive, but it's, like you said, a little hard to think of the cost effectiveness in terms of one outcome like this, because the BCC had so many effects, and we see that it's sort of sustained over the long term. So, the cost for having, depending on how long we find the effect lasts, kind of, if you are able to spend a certain amount, and I honestly wish I had the number in front of me, if that cost kind of leads to a reduction in IPV for years afterward, that could be well worth it, And we also find the BCC had effects on everything from child nutritional status to household assets, food security, a lot of things. So I think depending on your objectives, one would argue that the BCC was very cost effective, even though it was fairly expensive.
And just to add that we did do a study on cost effectiveness with respect to the different modalities, food or cash, and that was across 3 different countries, case studies. It was Ecuador, Uganda, and Yemen. For Ecuador, at least, we do see that in terms of food security, and so I think we were looking at cost effectiveness in terms of food security. In Ecuador, we do see that cash and vouchers are more cost effective than food in terms of improving sort of dietary diversity of households.
Yeah, and in Bangladesh too, cash was definitely cheaper than food. So to the extent that we see cash versus food doesn't matter much for the impacts on APB, if that was your only consideration, cash is likely more cost effective.
Maybe I think we have just a couple more questions I'd like to cover. One question that I had about just overall methods, and I'll tie it into a question that came in, was just about this the WHO instrument. What for those of us who aren't familiar with it, so you reported on frequency, yet necessarily not frequency, but whether IPV occurred in a period of time, but is there also information about frequency, severity, or other kinds of things? And then there was a question that came in the case of Mali and the polygamous households. Is it always the case that it would be from the male husband that was instigating the violence, or could it be from a co-wife or others? And can we know that also from the instrument?
Sure. So yeah, the WHO Violence Against Women instrument does have, it sort of is lifetime violence, so any violence experienced in your lifetime. Violence in the last, I think it's usually 12 months. So any violence experienced in the last 12 months. And then it does have the frequency of each of sort of the different types of violence. Now, in our case studies, it varied as to whether or not we included all sort of three components, that any in the last sort of 12 months and the frequency. But in all three case studies, we definitely looked at sort of the specific time frame. In Ecuador, it was a shorter time frame in the last 6 months as opposed to the last 12 months, because the program implementation, the program was only a 6-month program. But because it wasn't consistent, because we didn't have frequency consistent across all three case studies, we didn't actually look at the frequency in this. The other thing is that, yes, it is very important to note that it's not just sort of violence against women or against the husband inflicting violence on the wife. The wife could also inflict violence on the husband, or a co-spouse could inflict violence on another co-spouse, specifically in Mali. The way we implemented, we only asked about intimate partner violence. One thing to note is that when you're actually implementing the WHO Violence Against Women instrument, in order to sort of protect the woman, to protect her, you really only want to implement the instrument on one woman within the household. So it's very hard to collect data on multiple people within the household, because then it's sort of an issue of sort of protecting the woman that you're asking.
Yeah, just did you want
I'll just to add, in terms of the question on severity of violence, so frequency gets at that a little. The questions in the WHO instrument also don't just ask, have you been physically abused? They're very specific acts of violence. And the idea is that asking specifics and asking multiple times is likely to increase disclosure. So the specific acts are slapped you or thrown something at you that could hurt you, pushed you or shoved you or pulled your hair, hit you with his fist or with something else that could hurt you, kicked you, dragged you or beat you up, choked or burnt you on purpose, threatened to use or actually used a gun, knife, or other weapon against you. And there are, I think, categorizations of which are more severe if you wanted to look at it that way.
And some studies have looked at those aspects in the past?
Yeah. So in all three studies, we look at each individual act, and as well as construct any physical violence indicator.
Well, there's a couple more specific questions to Mali. Maybe I'll just pose those because I think we're a little bit over time. But there was a question about whether I think somebody offered a possible explanation about your polygamous versus monogamous results. They were wondering if perhaps the polygamous households were more food insecure at the beginning, and therefore the injection of cash transfers could have an effect. And if you wanted to comment on that. And then there was one more question about the targeting of there was a question about trying to understand better the rationale for targeting the males in the program in Mali. I think you did mention that why, but I guess they were wondering, is it also because of polygamy that is a factor behind that targeting of men in Mali? Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Those two.
I can't remember who went first last time. Go
You
ahead. Oh, okay. So those are both great questions. So the first one, were the polygamous households more food insecure at the start, and could that be an explanation? So we thought about that too, and I think they are a little more food insecure at base, like in the absence of the program. In our preliminary exploration, we haven't seen that kind of explains the difference in impacts, although we thought too that it might. But we're continuing to look at that. In terms of the targeting, it is possible that they partly did that because of polygamy. What they kind of told us when we asked the government if there was any potential to vary whether it was targeted to men or women, they basically said, like, we can't give it to women here because it would be seen as kind of counter to the way households work here, where the patriarch is the one who makes all the decisions about money.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. I think we'll close it here. We'll share all the questions. I think we touched on almost all of them, but there was a couple late ones coming in and so forth. So we'll share those with Melissa and Shalini, and we'll invite them to get back to you who posed those questions. So once again, thank you all online for participating. I think we had over 40, which was very good. And thanks to our presenters. Thank you very much.
Thank you.